On a humid December morning in 1944, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda stepped onto the remote Philippine island of Lubang with a rifle, a sword, and a set of orders that would quietly trap him outside history for nearly 3 decades. Japan was already losing the war, though few soldiers knew it. Onoda was not sent to win battles or hold ground. He was sent to endure. His mission was simple and absolute: conduct guerrilla warfare, destroy enemy supplies, and under no circumstances surrender or take his own life. The war, his commander told him, might last 3 years or 5. "We will come back for you," he promised. Onoda believed him. Born in 1922 in Wakayama Prefecture, Onoda grew up in a Japan that taught loyalty is sacred and surrender is shameful. Before Lubang, he had trained at the Nakano School, an elite academy that specialized in intelligence, sabotage, and psychological warfare. Unlike many Japanese soldiers, he was specifically instructed not to die in a suicidal charge. His role was patient. Survival itself was a weapon. Those lessons sank deep into his bones. Lubang was a small, green island of jungles and hills, far from the main arteries of war. When American forces landed in February 1945, Japanese resistance collapsed quickly. Onoda and a few other soldiers fled into the interior, watching from the trees as the world they knew burned and disappeared. Airstrips fell. Garrisons vanished. Yet Onoda interpreted every defeat through the logic he had been trained to trust. Deception was the enemy, his greatest tool. If the Americans appeared victorious, it was because they wanted him to believe the war was over. In the first months, Onoda was not alone. He formed a small unit with 3 other soldiers: Yuchi Akatsu, Sochi Shimada, and Kensichi. They stole rice from local farms, ambushed patrols when they could, and lived off bananas, coconuts, and stolen cattle. Their rifles were cleaned daily. Their uniforms, though tattered, were maintained with ritual care. Every action was justified as part of an ongoing war effort. Leaflets began to appear. They drifted down from planes or were left in villages, announcing that Japan had surrendered in August 1945. To Onoda, the messages were obvious. Propaganda. The leaflets were poorly worded, lacked proper military codes, and contradicted everything he knew about imperial resolve. Why would the enemy tell the truth? Why would they bother printing papers for 4 obscure soldiers if the war were truly over? He concluded that the leaflets were designed to flush them out. Over time, cracks formed in the group. Akatsu grew restless and afraid. In 1949, after weeks of argument, he slipped away and surrendered to Filipino authorities. Onoda interpreted the defection not as proof of peace, but as weakness. Akatsu, he believed, had been captured or broken. The remaining 3 doubled down on discipline. They moved camps frequently, avoided contact, and tightened their rules. Trust was survival. Years passed in cycles of rain and heat. Shimada was wounded in a firefight with local police and later killed in 1954 during a skirmish on the beach. Onoda and Kosuka buried him quietly, marking the spot in their memories. By now, the outside world had changed beyond recognition, but for Onoda, time had stopped. Every passing year without rescue only reinforced his belief that Japan was regrouping, that patience was still required. New leaflets arrived, this time with photographs, family letters, even newspapers. They spoke of Tokyo rebuilt, of American occupation ended, of a new constitution. Onoda examined every detail like an intelligence officer interrogating a prisoner. The enemy, he reasoned, had simply refined its psychological warfare. Real letters could be forged. Photos could be staged. The longer the deception continued, the more convinced he became that he was important. Why else would the enemy try so hard? Seasons blurred together, and Onoda's sense of self fused completely with his role. He no longer imagined a civilian life or a future beyond orders. The jungle was not a prison to him, but a front line. Hunger, disease, and isolation became tests of loyalty. Each sunrise was another day survived for the emperor. Each night was proof that discipline still mattered, even if no one was watching anymore. By the 1960s, Lubang's villagers lived in quiet fear of the ghost soldiers in the hills. Onoda and Kosuka still believing themselves at war, burned rice fields, and sabotaged infrastructure to disrupt what they saw as enemy logistics. To the islanders, it was senseless violence. To Onoda, it was duty. Each raid was reported in his mind to commanders who would one day return. In 1972, Kuzuka was shot and killed by local police while destroying a rice store. Onoda was now completely alone. 30 years old when he arrived. He was nearly 50, living as a soldier in a world that no longer had a war for him to fight. Yet his resolve did not waver. Alone in the jungle, he maintained his rifle, polished his boots, and waited for orders that never came. What Onoda did not know was that Japan had searched for him for years, assuming at first that he was dead, then slowly accepting the impossible truth that he might still be alive. For Onoda, however, there was no mystery. There was only the mission, and as long as no commanding officer stood before him to officially relieve him, the war, in his mind, was not over. Even as radios played unfamiliar music in distant villages and new roads cut through old paths, none of it mattered to him. Reality was defined by orders, not evidence. Doubt was the real enemy, and Onoda refused to let it win. This is where part 1 closes, with Hiroo Onoda still standing guard in the shadows, convinced that history itself is lying, and that loyalty means holding the line even when the world has already moved on without you leaving him alone with duty's silence and unwavering belief. The waiting continues, unbroken, unseen, forever. In 1974, the world Hiroo Onoda believed in finally came looking for him, but it did not arrive with gunfire or surrender leaflets. It arrived quietly, in the form of a young Japanese man with a backpack and an impossible mission. Norio Suzuki was not a soldier. He was a traveler, a dreamer, and perhaps a little reckless. He had set out from Japan with a strange list of goals: to find Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, to see a panda, and to discover the abominable snowman. Unlike the military searches that had failed for years, Suzuki carried no authority, no orders, and no expectations. What he carried instead was sincerity. When Suzuki entered the jungles of Lubang, he did not hide. He walked openly, calling out Onoda's name, speaking Japanese into the trees. 4 days, there was no response. Then, one afternoon, a thin, bearded man in a tattered uniform stepped out of the shadows, rifle in hand. Hiroo Onoda had not lowered his weapon for nearly 3 decades. Their meeting was tense, surreal. Suzuki bowed deeply, smiling, as if greeting a long-lost friend. He told Onoda the war had ended long ago. Onoda listened, calm but unmoved. He had heard these claims before. He told Suzuki he would only surrender if relieved by his commanding officer. Anything else was deception. Suzuki did not argue. He did not plead. He simply accepted Onoda's condition. Before leaving, he promised to return. Onoda watched him disappear into the jungle, unsure whether he had just encountered a trick or a miracle. True to his word, Suzuki returned this time with Major Yoshimito, Onoda's former commander, now an elderly man working in a bookstore in Japan. Taniguchi had been summoned from civilian life to finish a war that ended before many people alive could remember it. On March 9th, 1974, deep in the jungle, Taniguchi stood before his former subordinate. He read aloud the official orders. All combat activities were to cease. The unit was disbanded. Hiroo Onoda was relieved of duty. For the first time in 29 years, the foundation of Onoda's reality cracked. The words were formal. The voice was real. The authority undeniable. Slowly, carefully, Onoda removed his rifle, still functional after decades of jungle maintenance. He handed over his ammunition. Then, with visible effort, he unsheathed his sword and presented it. The war was over. On March 10th, 1974, Hiroo Onoda emerged from the jungle wearing his original uniform. It was faded and repaired countless times, but intact. He had survived nearly 3 decades of isolation, combat, and hunger. He had killed several Filipino civilians during his guerrilla actions, believing them to be enemy collaborators. The Philippines faced a dilemma. Onoda could be tried for murder. Instead, President Ferdinand Marcos granted him a full pardon, acknowledging that his actions were driven by the belief that he was still at war. When Onoda returned to Japan, The country he stepped into was unrecognizable. Neon lights replaced ruins. Bullet trains cut across landscapes once bombed into ash. The emperor was no longer divine. Japan was prosperous, modern, and peaceful. To many, Onoda was a hero, an embodiment of loyalty and endurance. To others, he was a painful reminder of a militaristic past Japan was trying to forget. Onoda himself felt lost. The values that had sustained him were no longer honored. Discipline had softened. Obedience had been replaced by individualism. Fame overwhelmed him. Interviews, cameras, crowds, none of it made sense. In the Yongle, survival had been simple. In modern Japan, he felt like a relic put on display. Struggling to adapt, Onoda eventually left Japan for Brazil, where he became a cattle rancher. The land was vast, quiet, and demanding something he understood. Years later, he returned to Japan and founded a survival school, teaching young people self-reliance, discipline, and respect for nature, not war. Yet the question lingered, was Hiroo Onoda a hero or a tragedy? He had obeyed orders perfectly, but those orders had frozen him in time. His loyalty was absolute, but it cost lives others and his own. He lost youth, family, and decades of peace. His war did not end in 1945. It simply faded into silence. Onoda never expressed regret for following his orders. He believed a soldier's duty was to obey, not to judge. But in later years, his reflections softened. He spoke about the danger of blind obedience, about the importance of thinking beyond commands. Hiroo Onoda died in 2014 at the age of 91. He had outlived the empire he served, the war he fought, and the world that created him. His story remains unsettling because it forces a question history does not like to answer. When does loyalty become imprisonment? When does duty stop being honorable and start becoming tragic? In the end, Hiroo Onoda did not fight for 29 years because he was insane or cruel. He fought because he believed, completely and without doubt, that faithfulness mattered more than reality itself. And perhaps that is the most haunting part of his story, not that he stayed in the jungle for 29 years, but that in his mind, he was never lost at all. He was simply waiting for orders.